Okay, the second video in Unit 5 is going to start off talking about the second and the third agricultural revolutions, which basically are the two more modern, massive changes that come in farming. And remember, when we say revolution, we're talking about a big, significant change. And of course, the common denominator in all of this is going to be technology. But the technology of the second agricultural revolution is very much mechanical, where the technology of the third agricultural revolution can often be described as being more scientific. So when you think about any agricultural revolution, one of the first things they might ask you is, what is one of the effects? And basically, the most important thing you need to know is that you're always going to produce more food. The very scientific way to say that is we're going to increase yields, right? We're going to have higher yields of food. Remember, farming is all about inputs and outputs. The inputs are the seeds, the fertilizer, the water, the labor. The output, of course, is the food that you grow. And if it's commercial farming, of course, the money that you make from it. When we talk about the second agricultural revolution, this is about the time of the Enclosure Acts in the United Kingdom. It was a time of big landowners and a lot of very poor peasant itinerant type farmers. But what was happening was that with machinery, many people left the farm and went to the urban areas looking for jobs in the new factories of the 17 and 1800s. So things like the metal plow, the mechanical reaper, the cotton gin, internal steam engines and combustion engines. There's famous people from this second agricultural revolution: Cyrus McCormick, Jethro Tull, who invented the seed drill, Eli Whitney with the cotton gin. But another big part of the second agricultural revolution was a better usage of the land itself. They started to rotate crops, where you would have maybe a grain crop on one field, and then on a second field you'd be planting something with a lot of nitrogen or rejuvenating the soil, because if you grow the same crop year after year, the soil is depleted of nutrients. So you would see like maybe a mustard seed or clover or something that would regenerate the field. And then maybe one field would be fallow and you wouldn't grow anything at all. Of course, in today's world, we don't need to leave the land fallow because we have chemical fertilizers, which is part of the third agricultural revolution, and we're able to increase the fertile quality of the soil. Even on land today that's more marginal, we're able to produce a lot more food than ever before. So in this third agricultural revolution, you're going to see this later in the slideshow, the big thing is that it's a shift from subsistence to commercial. This was still in the time period of the 1800s, people were still pretty much growing food for themselves and their own family. Third agricultural revolution, it's going to be a big shift to corporate control, agribusiness, these big gigantic food companies, $500,000 tractors, planting only one crop, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of only one thing, like wheat or corn in the United States. Remember, corn is our biggest agricultural product. It could be soybeans, could be, whatever it is, almond trees in California, grapes in Napa and Sonoma. That's what we mean by monoculture, one crop. Heavy use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, killing the weeds, killing the bugs. Remember, you never kill everything, which means that there's evolutionary resistance to those chemicals, which means that the chemical companies and the farmers constantly have to be inventing new types of treatments. And of course, in most recent years, the genetic engineered food, the GMOs. Very important that you know, there was an essay question about the Green Revolution on the exam about 2001 or so, and it asked about the Green Revolution between the 50s and, say, 1985. A lot of kids started talking about GMOs and genetically engineered food, and that was all wrong because the time frame prohibited you from answering that. Those things didn't exist on the scale that they were talking about until after 1985. So this is what we mean by crop rotation. Again, your cereal crop, in this case corn, maybe like turnips or something like that, that the animals could forage and it would regenerate the soil. And then one field that's fallow, left open so that the land could just rest and recover. So this three-field system was very big in Great Britain. Charles Townshend, one of the members of Parliament, and it was known as the Townshend system, and they called him Turnip Townshend because he advocated for farmers growing turnips as a cover crop. So when you think about today in the United States, this is very much what we saw in the food machine, and this is a monoculture. This one here, uh, again, tough to tell from the height, but this one looks like it could be wheat. And again, the biggest way to figure it out is you look at the tractor and you look at the implements that are actually, this is with the rows in between it. It's more likely to be corn because wheat would not have such defined rows here. But when you see these big monocultures, these are farms that are sometimes measured in square miles. And remember, 640 acres to a square mile. So machinery and mechanization, originally part of the second agricultural revolution, but generally nowadays when we talk about machinery, we're talking about these big combine harvesters, these tractors that do 4 or 5 different jobs on the farm. Remember, we were talking in the movie that back 100 years ago, a farmer might be able to get 20 bushels per acre. Remember, a bushel is a big 8-gallon container. You could get 20 bushels an acre. Today, they're getting 300 bushels an acre with all of this new technology and machinery. So agribusiness, the industrialization of agriculture. In the United States today, less than 2% of Americans are engaged in agriculture and farming. Yet we're producing food for over 330 million people here domestically, plus exporting tremendous amounts of food all over the world, not only in the form of free food aid to less developed countries, and that's usually rice and other types of products that are able to withstand the shipping. But we're also exporting meats, and we're exporting cheeses, and we're exporting all kinds of things that are commercially grown crops. So this is a big part of the Green Revolution. And of course, this is not super efficient in terms of energy use. It is efficient in the sense that it creates a lot of food at a very cheap price. And of course, Americans eat a lot of calories. So when we say that there's hunger in the world, remember there's more hungry people today than ever before in human history. So how could Malthus be wrong? He was worried there wouldn't be enough food to feed everybody. The reality is we're producing way over capacity, but it's not an equitable distribution of that food. And the places in the world that are at shortages of food, that have food insecurity, oftentimes, those are places in the world that have tremendous amounts of conflict. They're areas of the world that don't necessarily have great government. They're areas of the world where poverty is rampant. And remember that without money, it's hard to buy food and produce food. Even if the food were free, sometimes it's too expensive because you have to account for the transportation of the food, the distribution, the storage, the warehousing of the food when it gets to the lesser developed countries. So remember when we talk about the difference between subsistence and commercial, this is an excellent chart. If you really just kind of run down through here, everything on the left side is subsistence. Everything on the right side is commercial. Tons of vocab words here. We've already talked about agribusiness. We've talked about monoculture. Make sure you know the difference between intensive and extensive farming. Usually intensive is going to be a small plot or a small farm size. Most farms in the world today are less than a hectare. A hectare is 3 acres in size. However, most farms in the United States are hundreds of acres, if not thousands of acres, which again are measured more often in like square miles. And you'll see that when you do the geo inquiry on your Chromebook. So make sure you know the difference, the private ownership of the land in subsistence, the corporate ownership of the land with commercial. Commercial, the inputs are always going to be purchased. Things like machinery, the tractors, the irrigation. Remember Ted Sheely, the farmer in California, he had a $2 million irrigation system for his tomato crop. Subsistence farmers, those inputs are always going to be either free or super cheap. So instead of fertilizer, they're going to depend on like animal dung or manure. Instead of irrigation, they're going to hope for rain. This is the kind of farming that is very, very, very small farm size, and they're only feeding their families, doing most of the work, of course, by hand. And all over the world, a lot of the subsistence farm work today is being done by women. Don't forget that in this test, you're going to have to talk about how women are being affected economically, socially, culturally, politically, and environmentally by all of the different units we've talked about, whether it's fertility rate, whether it's culture, whether it's family roles, societal roles and expectations, education, careers and job opportunities, political issues, whether they live in rural places or cities. The lifestyles of women have been changing because historically women have been a big part of cooking food and preparing food and managing the foodstuffs for the family. And that's changing as women become more educated and get bigger, better jobs outside the home and make more money and become more equal. Some of those roles are changing about who's cooking and who's in charge of food for the family. So again, intensive versus extensive. I have a couple of pictures I'm going to show you here in just a second. Intensive, remember, the inputs are spread over very small pieces of land. The land use is often repeated. That's what we mean by intensive. The land is intensively being used. Of course, this results in the farm becoming exhausted. And again, most of the time, these people don't have the big chemical fertilizers that are now available on the market for big, gigantic farms like in the United States. So when we think about intensive land use, this is where the soil is going to be really used up in a very short time. And sometimes this will end up being used in a kind of shifting cultivation where farmers can't stay on the land very long. And when the land gets exhausted, they have to move and go somewhere else. You'll see a slide about shifting cultivation later in the show. Extensive agriculture. The inputs are now being spread over huge tracts of land. Again, hundreds of acres, maybe even square miles. So again, the land use here will be typically monoculture. It's going to be seasonal. They're not growing crops year round. They use tons of purchased inputs on this kind of farming. And this is very, very typical when you see this in the farming of the United States. Now, there is a kind of intensive, subsistence, but extensive. And this would be like nomadic herding, pastoralism, where it's subsistence because they're not selling the crop. And it's usually animals, sheep or goat herding or something like that. It is extensive because it takes up tremendous amounts of land. Think about transhumance, where they follow the crops up into the mountains during the summertime for pastures and cooler weather. And then in the winter, when there's no grass available at the high altitude, they bring the animals down into the valley below. Today, this extensive is harder and harder to continue to practice in the poorer countries of the world as they develop, as they create infrastructure, transportation, highways connecting throughout the country. This has really disrupted the way of life for some of those nomadic pastoralists. Now, when we think about intensive sedentary, this is a great example. And this is in Africa, and the crop that you see here. This is sorghum. And what the women are doing here is that they're kind of threshing it. And so they've got, like a mortar and pestle, and they're smashing the seeds there and knocking the seeds off. And then, of course, they'll collect those, and then they'll distribute those out. And again, the women will work collectively. They'll help each other out, maybe different women of the village. They might be related to each other or part of the same tribal clan. So they'll work together. But again, notice the work is being done by hand. Notice that it's a very, very small amount of food. This is very typical of intensive subsistence farming. All right, as opposed to in the United States, where we have commercial farming and extensive farming, and you see these huge $500,000 tractors that we saw in the movie. And of course, I told you at the time, make sure you know the difference between wheat and corn, what they look like. First of all, corn about as tall as a human. Always the implements are these big, sharp, pointy things on the front. The corn is cut down, and it goes into the combine harvester, drops into the hopper. The corn will shoot out the chute. Usually there's a truck that's going to collect the corn. This is the wheat thresher. This is, if you've seen Cars, when Lightning McQueen and Mater go turn over all the cow tractors, this is where Frank comes barreling through the fence, and he's got this big roller combine on the front that's going to cut down the wheat and again separate the grain from the chaff and shoot it back into the hopper. So this is very extensive and very commercial. Again, these tractors are $500,000 or more. They're like a fighter jet inside. Most farmers, if they can afford one, that's a lot. Sometimes it'll be companies that will go around the country and they own 4, 5, 6 of these tractors, and they'll offer their services to farmers to harvest their crop. Another type of extensive, but this one more subsistence, and this will be like ranching. It could be commercial. In this case, this is New Zealand, and it is commercial because New Zealand does export not only the meat, but also the wool. And the merino wool sweaters that are so expensive. And nowadays you'll see even things like in Peru where they have the alpaca and they make the sweaters, and it's always that first cut, the virgin wool, that's the softest and the most expensive. But this is another example of extensive types of agriculture and pastoral nomadic land use. Esther Boserup, real quick, let's hit her. It's this thesis that Malthus said there wouldn't be enough food because there were going to be too many people. Boserup's kind of the exact opposite. She sees that population growth is the cause of greater agricultural productivity, because when you have more people, you need to grow more food. And plus, with more people, there's more labor. There's more people that could be smart and come up with good ideas. There's people that will come up with new innovations and new techniques. So Boserup says that as populations increase, the farmers have to become more intensified. They have to grow more food on less land. And of course, that's true. We are doing that. We're growing more food in America today with less farms because we have more technology, we have more water, we have the irrigation of the Ogallala Aquifer throughout most of the Midwestern United States. Our yields are just massively increasing. So Boserup, kind of the opposite of Malthus in that sense. Really, if you look at this chart, it kind of shows you. Remember, Malthus predicted that food production would be linear, and he said that population would be exponential, leading to this Malthusian catastrophe where there would be too many people and not enough food, right? And so what would happen was there would be these extinctions. Mass amounts of people would die because the population had exceeded the capacity of farmers to produce enough food for the people. But the reality is that Boserup says that every time we get close to that point, farmers have innovated. And you think about the second agricultural revolution, the third agricultural revolution, the new technologies of today like genetically engineered food. She's saying that we'll always find a way to produce more food when this crisis is looming, that there could be starvation or that there could be famine. We always find ways to be able to ramp up productivity and increase our yields. Okay, that's it for video 2. We'll be back soon. Sorry, I ran over a little bit over 15 on this one, but I definitely wanted to get Boserup in before this one ended.